Hello, and you are very welcome back to Film Resolved, and this is Quick Tips, so let's just jump right in. So before we jump in, just a quick bit of housekeeping that is definitely worth watching because it will just make sure that the tutorial makes sense and runs smoothly. But of course, time codes in the description if you want to jump straight ahead to the good stuff. So the first thing to note here is that we are not going to be covering every single use case for in and out points. We're just going to cover the most, at least what for me are the most frequent ones. And we're going to cover enough that the intention here is that you'll come away with a good foundation of how in and out points work, so that for those more nuanced use cases that you'll be able to figure it out for yourself because of having built up that foundation. The next thing I wanted to clear up is the fact that I will be using keyboard shortcuts here. Now, I'm using 3 sets of keyboard shortcuts, one for adding an in and out point, another for jumping to an in and an out point, and then another for clearing the in and out points. The keyboard shortcuts for adding an in and adding an out point are the default Davinci Resolve shortcuts of I and O. So let's have a look at that. We'll bring up a clip into our source window here. So I for adding an in point and O for adding an out point, and all of these apply to both the source window and the timeline. Then where I differ from the default shortcuts, and because of just how much I use in an out points, it's definitely worth my while doing this. Your use case might be different. So jump to in and jump to out is Shift I and O. So Shift I, jump to in, Shift O, jump to out point. And then again, for clearing the in and out point, it's Alt I and Alt O. And those are just mine, not the default. So Alt I will clear the in point, Alt O will clear the out point. So just to be clear, I and O, that's default for adding an in and an out point. After that, for jump to and removing, Shift and Alt respectively, that's my own personal keyboard customization. I find it really handy though, you might too. So going forward, I will be using a lot of that keyboard shortcuts, and just so you know what they are, and I'll do my best to commentate as we do that. The next thing that's worth mentioning before we jump in, and it's always something you should be keeping in mind, is there's a relationship between the in and out points you've added to your source material and the timeline. And depending on just what combination you use, you will get different results of how the footage gets dropped in to the timeline. So if you're not quite getting the desired results, that's the best thing to do, is take a look at how you've set your in and out points within the source window versus your timeline, because odds are if you're not getting the results you want, that's what's going on, and that you might just need to have a second look, correct it, and then move forward. That's super common. I make mistakes all the time with my in and out points when I'm blazing through an edit, and you just have to do a quick Control or Command Z to go back a step, fix the issue, and you launch forward. It happens, that's totally normal. And then lastly, just to avoid any confusion, especially when I'd imagine it's going to be a lot of beginners looking at this, is I've got some B-raw settings set up for the project as a whole, which is why once clips are getting dropped into the timeline, they're automatically appearing to be somewhat graded, i.e. a bit of contrast and a bit of saturation. So just in case that causes any confusion as to why it's flat in the source, and once it's hitting the timeline, it looks somewhat color graded, at the very least corrected. It's just because I've got some kind of global project settings going on with the B-raw footage, and that's all that is. So let's actually jump into the tutorial itself. To show how everything works, I'm basically going to go and edit a really, really simple sequence as I normally would, essentially, and that should showcase the good few different ways of using in and out points and get you up to speed with how they work. So I am working on a documentary at the moment, and we are doing some sample interviews as camera tests to determine just how we want these things to work. To put a long story short, this is a quick soundbite from one of the camera angles, and it hasn't been trimmed or anything like that. That's not the point of this tutorial. So there's a lot of ums and ahs. So please excuse that, and we'll use our imagination a bit because the point still remains the same. So we've got a soundbite and we've got some B-roll that we're going to start dropping over this soundbite and this interview to build a bit of a sequence. So let's have a listen to the soundbite first.
So anything, if you're feeling stressed, that I would have done, like I'd go boxing, can't do that. You can't go to the gym. You can't go for, like I can't go surfing now because it's outside of the county. And like you're restricted to 5 kilometers for a walk, and you live in Mayo and it rains every day. So it's like you lose those outlets.
Okay, cool. So we're going to build out a sequence and we're going to be using in and out points. So let's start with adding our first kind of little sequence of 3 or 4 shots. So obviously this footage doesn't quite align properly with what the subject happens to be saying. So again, just use our imaginations a bit here. This isn't a tutorial on, good editing or anything like that, just showing off in and out points.
So anything, if you're feeling stressed, that I would have done, like I'd go boxing, can't do that.
So let's pretend we want to cut away from our interview subject here and launch into some supporting B-roll. Let's add an in point on the timeline here, and we'll go and add an out point where we want the end of the first clip to end, our first cutaway.
You can't go to the gym. You can't go for, like I can't go surfing now.
And let's say an out point there. So this is our first kind of sample of an in and an out point on the timeline. So let's have a look at the clip we're going to drop in here. So we can see that the first 10 or so seconds of the clip is dead space, and it's only here that the subject walks in. So let's say we want this clip to be what we call an in action kind of dominant clip. We're given the action on the in point is what we want to kind of be most concerned with. So I'll add an in point and no out point. Next, it's really important to make sure you've set your correct target tracks on your timeline. Right now I'm on video 1 and audio 1. So if I were to add this in, it would actually wipe out our interview, and we don't want that. So we'll go video track 2 and audio track 2 respectively. Now there's several ways of dropping this down, but I'm going to go ahead and use the keyboard shortcut F10 for a simple overwrite edit, and that's the default shortcut is F10. Alternatively, you can drag the clip over to your timeline preview window and you'll get all your different options: insert, overwrite, replace, fit to fill, place on top, append to end, and ripple overwrite. So we're going to use overwrite, which is the default, by the way. If you just go like that, it'll be overwrite, or you can go directly onto overwrite to get that in, or I'm just going to go to Control Z to get rid of that, F10. And what that's done is, because we had an in and an out point on our timeline and only an in point on our source clip, it has filled that in and out gap, starting with the in point of our source. So as we cut to that footage, it'll be just as our subjects walk into the frame, because that's where we set our in point. So let's have a look.
Can't do that. You can't go to the gym. You can't go for...
Great. Alternatively, I'm going to go and Control Z, in and out point back to where we want it. I'm going to use Alt I back on our source, and say we want an out point dominant action to be the cut point. So there's a little flick of the arm here. Say that's what we want to be our out point. Hit an out point with no in point, hit F10. And now that in and out point on the timeline will be filled with that clip based on that out point. So we'll have a look at that.
Oh, for like I can't go surfing
flick
now
of the wrist and cut out. And in this case, it's actually not that far off from having the same in point as well. That's just a bit fluky.
Can't do that. Can't go to the...
So that's how in and out points behave in a situation where you have an in and out on the timeline and only an in or out on your source clip. Next, let's look at kind of like the inverted of that. Let's set an in point on our timeline, and we'll come to our next clip, which I believe is this. And now we're in, I'm going to get rid of the I and O point from when I was testing this tutorial out. This is a clip where the director says, I absolutely want both the in and the out action of this clip. The in action being as the subject enters the frame. So we'll add an in point there, and we'll scrub through, and just as the subject exits the frame, we have an out point. We absolutely want that chunk of the footage in there. So now we're in an in and out on our source, and just an in, or it could be an out, but we're going to stick with an in for the timeline here. And again, F10, we'll drop that down. And now
because
we have our in action.
Like you're restricted to 5 kilometers for a walk, and you live in Mayo and it rains every day.
And an out action. Alternatively, as we saw before, you could also just drag and drop straight over to anywhere on the image here. We'll do automatically an overwrite. or you can go onto the actual overwrite text, or if you wanted one of the others, you could go for that too. Or you could actually just drop it straight down like that and align it manually. That's another way of doing it, but I don't like that. My preferred is the keyboard shortcut. Control Z that a lot because I just mashed the keyboard and F10 there. And note how I accidentally wrote the audio incorrectly. So just making sure that your target tracks are selected correctly. A happy accident there to show that what happens when you do that wrong. So let's have a look at how our sequence is looking now.
Can't do that. You can't go to the gym. You can't go for, like, I can't go surfing now because it's outside the county. And like, you're restricted to 5 kilometers for a walk, and you live in Mayo and it rains every day.
Great. So for the last example here, let's look at adding a bit of a time lapse. So for example, we don't want to cut back to our subject just yet. We're going to definitely continue on with some B-roll here. So we'll add an in. And we know for sure that for this last line, we want to be cutting back to the subject. So we're hitting out there.
You lose those outlets.
We definitely want to cut back there. So we want that to be open. So we're just going to fill this space. But the next shot in our sequence begins at this endpoint in the source. And we want to have it go all the way down till the subject stops at the waterline there. And this clip is definitely way too long for here. So what we can do is drag it over and use fit to fill. And that would automatically speed it up precisely to fill that gap as a time lapse. And obviously this wasn't shot with the intention of being a time lapse, so it looks rubbish, but you get the point. So let's have a look at that.
And you live in Mayo and it rains every day. So it's like you
So that's an example of having an in and an out point in your source and an in and an out point in your timeline, and one of the ways you can control that behavior. Other options would be to sacrifice the in or out point from your source, or sacrifice the in and out point on your timeline. Is different options if you were to go for, say, an overwrite. But that's an example. A really good way of doing time lapses, in my opinion, is because oftentimes you will have a chunk or a window in your edit where you want that time lapse to go, and rather than dropping this entire clip down and going Control R and using, say, change speed to 400 and guesstimating, oh, will that fit, won't it, do I have to trim that further now to fit into that space? I just find that using in and out points and letting Resolve automate the speed percentage increase is the best way of doing it. So a really handy way of doing time lapses, in my opinion. So we've built out a little teeny tiny sequence there using in and out points. We had a look at firstly using in and out on the timeline and just an in or an out in our source. Then we looked at just an in on our timeline with an in and an out on our source. And then lastly, we looked at in and out in your source as well as in and out on your timeline, and the many different ways in which that can behave. Then after this, we're just going to come into a sequence that's cut to the beat. So this is just to show how this is really handy for dropping in clips to the beat of music. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to add in a song super quick, and I'm just going to blast through this. Here's the first use of it. And I'd highly recommend turning down the audio right about now a little bit, because this song is mixed right up to -0 as per most royalty-free music. So just a heads up, turn the headphones down a little bit now to save your ears. Okay, right there is our kind of first bass hit. Where'd you go? There it is. I'm going to add my in point, come to the start of our sequence. I'm going to make sure my target track is selected to this audio track 4, which for me in my kind of standard sequence is always my music track. And what I'm going to do is give that an in point, and I'm going to get an out point up to about 40 seconds for now, just to get a decent bit of that dropped in. We'll hit F10. Down it goes, and I'm also going to select that and bring it down to -28 for now. And
so anything, if you're feeling stressed, that I would have done, like I'd go boxing, can't do.
Now the music is just sitting under. Then what I'm going to go do is come to the end here, come back 6 frames, I'm going to add a keyframe, and then I'm going to come forward 12 frames. And I'm going to add another keyframe, and we're going to make that -12 so we're not blasting the ears off anyone. And that's just a simple audio duck up. Just so we can come into our music sequence now. So what I'm going to do is add an in point so we don't have any black frames right there. And this, we're going to keep going on the hits of the snares every 8 or so bars. So there is our snare hit. And here's something to watch out for when cutting to the beat. Our playhead just landed on the hit of the beat. So you'd be forgiven for thinking if I hit O there and drop a clip in, the clip will cut on the beat. But you actually get an extra frame overhang. So what I'm just in the habit of doing is, let's come back a few frames. I know I'm near a beat, I start scrubbing through, and just a little tip, if you're not hearing your audio when you scrub, Shift S is the default shortcut for turning that on and off, because it can be annoying, although I rely on it heavily. So if you're not hearing that as you shuffle, hit Shift S, that turned it off. Shift S back on. So if you're not hearing that, that's all that is. Hit Shift S to toggle that feature on and off. Okay, so we find our beat, we hit our out point, and it's overhanging by 1 frame. So I'm in the habit of, the second I hear that beat, back 1 frame, then I hit my out point. And when the clip gets filled in, which you'll see in a second, it will actually be cut on the beat. So let's have a look at that. We'll come back into our video clips, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna go and do 4 or 5 shots here just to build out a little sequence to the beat to show how this all works. So we will go, let's do this clip based on an out point. So we definitely want this. We want that to be our out point. So I'll make that an out, and it will automatically fill in, and hopefully have a reasonable in point. We'll see how that looks. And again, just making sure our target tracks are what we desire. For argument's sake, let's make it video track and audio track 3, just for shits and giggles. And that's where they will land. Let's have a look at that.
Those outlets.
Okay, so in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Coming up on that 8th beat, find it and add our out point. And on this one, I'm not going to come back to frame, and you'll see what's happened. So the beat is on our playhead. Let's come in for the tighter shot of this. And we'll do this based on an in point of she's starting away and then she'll look towards the camera. We'll add an in point, and we drop. Let's drop this down onto track 2. So we went to track 2. It automatically filled into our in point. Looks at the camera. And that beat is technically slightly a smidge off, because that's where our snare drum hit actually is, and it's given us a frame extra. So that's why you'll want to do the following. So again, an in point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There. So that's our actual hit. Back 1, our out point, because it actually overhangs by 1 frame. So unlike the last one where we had to dial back a frame, in hindsight, we preempt that because we now know how the in and out points work. So we'll come in for this shot. No, we won't. Come in for this one. I already have an in point here that I'm happy with from my samples earlier, so I'll drop that straight in. And that beat probably works better on that bass drum hit. So I'm just gonna undo that. And we'll add our kind of final shot in here. And I'll do this one a little differently. So there's our in point. And let's say we know for sure we want 3 seconds of footage and 2 seconds of a fade out. So we want a 5-second clip. Well, shift and forward or back arrow is to go back and forth by 1 second. So if I have an in point there and I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, out point, drop that in, and we can do our 2-second dissolve. We'll have a 5-second clip with, let's say for argument's sake, 3 seconds of actual footage with 2 seconds of footage there for our dissolve lead out. Cool. And then lastly, for in and out points, it's not only about adding material to the timeline, but you can also use it to remove or lift material from the timeline. So you can do that in 2 different ways. So I'm going to come down to the end of our song here to show the first version. We can add an in and an out point. And if we hit backspace, it will lift the footage and won't have any rippling going on, i.e. it just took out that chunk and left an empty space. Or Control Z, what I'll do is we'll give that an extra 2 seconds beyond when the fade out happens of our visuals. Hit an in and come to the very end or beyond and hit out. And we can hit the delete key and that'll outright remove it. And if there was any material after this, so let's, for argument's sake, just drop this in there. If there was any material after that, that'll get pulled back. So that's a really handy way for when I'm chopping up interviews, I will have the interview only in a timeline first. And that's typically how I go by trimming the interview. I'll set an in at the start of fluff that I don't want and an out where that fluff ends. And then I'll hit delete and everything will just ripple and, you know, close for me and play cleanly. And then we'll just go and give that a couple of seconds of a fade as well. And let's have a look at this sequence that we created using nothing but in and out points. And of course, noting this, that again, the B-roll isn't super relevant to the visuals, but just for a demonstration's sake, proves the point of editing using in and out points.
So anything, if you're feeling stressed, that I would have done, like I'd go boxing, can't do that. You can't go to the gym. You can't go for, like I can't go surfing now because it's outside the county. And like you're restricted to 5 kilometers for a walk and you live in Mayo and it rains every day. So it's like you lose those outlets.
Cool. And then just before we wrap up, one last quick benefit of in and out points is, say we have our director come in and say, not really digging this shot, can we swap it out for something else? It's really easy to do that with just an in at the start, go to the end, come back that 1 frame, hit an out, find the shot you want to replace that with, and we'll scrub through this nice lens flare-y shot of some leaves because I'm really original when I go out filming. We give that an in point. And again, just making sure that we have the correct tracks targeted. So we want to replace track 2 of video and audio. So we've selected video track 2 and audio track 2, F10, and we've replaced that shot super easily using in and out points. Great. So again, this wasn't covering every single use case for in and out points, but we covered many of the basic and super common ones. And that should be enough of a primer and a foundation for you to go forward and experiment and figure out other use cases that might work for you. And I hope that it helps speed up your editing and helps with your creativity, because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one. As always, I hope you found this tutorial helpful. Did I miss something that should have been covered in this tutorial? Leave a comment below so we know to cover it in a future video. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future uploads. My name is Lee Dalton. This is Film Resolved. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.